challenging decisions, and I think that needs to be a discussion. But this is an ombudsman's case that I think that we ought to cherish. A couple of years back now. So this is an adult with significant learning disabilities, and he lived with his parents, and he had 50 days of replacement care to enable his parents to have a break. And of course this is an issue that is becoming very prevalent in the sense that the average life expectancy, I think, of somebody with Down syndrome 30 years ago was 20, whereas today it's almost the national average. That with the closure of the mental handicap hospitals and these appalling regimes, suddenly people with profound learning disabilities are living proper lives and having proper lifespans, or almost proper lifespans. And so you're ending up with quite a lot of people with quite significant learning disabilities being cared for by older people. And of course, caring for somebody with significant learning disabilities in a care home or in a residential setting can be incredibly expensive. So these parents are a very cheap alternative, but you've got to enable them to be resilient to continue. So they're getting 50 days a week replacement care, or they were, until 2015. And, you know, as it seems to be so typical, I mean, it may be that I only hear the bad news stories, but it's so common for people to contact and say, well, we were getting 50 days, and now we've been told we can only get 14 days. Of course, he hasn't changed. He may have become slightly more dependent, but he hasn't miraculously recovered from his sort of dependency. And the social worker, when the decision made to cut it by 36 days a year, noted that there was the sustainability of his parents was at risk. And it's this point I started from the beginning. It's about evidence. What has happened to change the situation from when they were getting 50 days a week? What's changed? Now, under the old law, they could say, well, we've changed our eligibility criteria. We only do critical and substantial, and we used to do moderate. There was a curious eligibility criteria pre-2015. But under the new criteria, then they're set by Parliament. You can't change them. So what changed to mean that he, instead of needing 50 days respite care, only needs 14? The evidence has got to come from the local authority to tell us what has changed. It needs to show what circumstances have changed to warrant this reduction of respite provision. And the council said, oh, well, we'll offer support in emergency. And the Ombudsman said, that's just not acceptable. And then she said this: the parents' needs for weekends away and a little social life are not emergencies, but part of a planned sustainable support regime. The council doesn't address these sustainable issues, and the guidance says that the impact on carers' daily lives and non-caring activities must be included. So in those situations when you have that, you have to say, what has changed? You tell us why this person suddenly no longer needs what they've always needed. And you can't say, oh, well, we've changed our criteria, because it's not in your gift anymore. It's been set by Parliament. And the Ombudsman also said that care and support plans should not only say very precisely what we're providing to meet your needs, but they should also have contingency plans. What happens if completely unexpectedly Christmas happens on the 25th of December this year, or you have a bank holiday on a Friday? What happens in those situations? Or completely unexpectedly a carer becomes ill, or something happens like that. You should have plan Bs. And the fact that these may be difficult to predetermine in certain cases doesn't mean that they're not, that local authorities are absolved from this responsibility. I want to have a real go at funding panels. They're pretty well illegal, or unlawful, let's put it at its best. Social care is about evidence. A social worker or somebody employed by social services comes out and assesses the disabled person. She or he spends time with them. We're told that 75% of all the information we take in is visual. They see the environment. And you know, it's a really big thing going into people's houses. It gives you a just enormous amount of information. And it's not just what you see, it's what you hear, what you smell, it's all your senses. You record information that is sent by all of these people, and it's not just what is written down, it's the tone, it's the tears, it's the expressions, and you take that back to your deep pile carpeted mahogany desk local authority office. You open the drinks cabinet, you get the claret out, you put your feet on the table and you light a pipe. And you do a really curious activity which is called professional judgment. You use all your training as a professional social worker or social services employee. You look at all the evidence that you've gathered and you decide whether this person has needs according to these criteria and whether they don't. That's what you do, your professional judgment. There's a lot of research on this. They're called street level bureaucracy, a wonderful book by somebody called Lipsky 30 years ago. So this professional makes this decision. And she or he says to the family, well, I think you do need this, but I'm sorry, I can't write this down because, or I can't, it's not my decision, it's got to go to a panel. You say, well, that's really interesting. What's a panel? Oh, I can't tell you, it's a secret. Or these days, I'm being told that Oxford's doesn't have a secret panel anymore, and then I'm told that families can, if they want, choose to go to the panel. But you know, that's pretty daunting. I'd need an advocate with me. I mean, it's a pretty daunting thing to go, you know, before a group of professionals. But what's the panel doing? Because normally the social worker, if the social worker is bold and young, they will say, well, this person needs this. It goes to the panel, and they say, no, they're not going to get that, cut it. They need 50 days, no, cut it to 14. It's a panel, a senior officer that's making that decision. The social workers are often, and sometimes the social worker, as they then say, well, we can't possibly recommend this because you'll never get it. So the panel has this sort of chilling effect on professional judgment. But when you go to court, the court says, well, what's the panel doing? Because the law says you've got to meet need regardless of cost, it seems to us, the judges will say, or the ombudsman will say, that the panel's protecting the budget. Oh, no. It's nothing to do with money. It's about quality control. So we did a survey in community care, and we had 60 different names for the panel. They were sort of quality control, love and happiness meetings, and you know, none of them said rationing meeting. But of course the panel's there to cut the budget, and we know that because we can look up the county council minutes and we can see that they introduced the panel when they had a budget problem. But they're not allowed to do that because you've got to meet need. Why are they saying that I don't need what this social worker has said? She sat with them, she used her experience, she listened, she used her visual memory, she did all of that. What knowledge, what evidence has the panel got to contradict that? And of course the answer is they don't have any knowledge. They weren't there. They weren't party to this process. Sorry.
So could you actually refuse to allow your social worker to go to panel? So this isn't lawful.
No, I don't think so.
You don't know my son,
Did everybody hear that? Sorry.
Yes.
That off the microphone statement. I don't think you can refuse. I don't think it's unlawful. I mean, the point is that it's pointless.
So you can actually use the fact that it's a waste of money.
Well, it's obviously very cost effective because they save lots of money on it. It isn't actually, because it creates crises that are then very expensive.
Well, it creates tribunals as well.
I don't know that you could refuse. I don't think you probably can. I mean, I think you can ask what knowledge that person on the panel has and what they're doing. And they'll say, well, this is purely benchmarking, quality control stuff. I mean, nearly every local authority I deal with knows that these things are very dodgy, and they're awfully apologetic about them.
Apologetic isn't going to help. I know that Oxfordshire has said that we can ask to go to panel now.
But what is it? What are they doing? And of course, they are countermanding professional decisions. I mean, if a doctor says you need something, you don't expect, you need some penicillin or whatever. You don't expect that to have to go to a panel of managers at the CECG. I mean, it'll probably happen soon, but at the moment, professionals make those sort of decisions. What is it they bring to bear? The problem, of course, is that if you know that, you will normally get the panel to back down.
So if we all say, right, I want to know why I have to take this budget that you've paid this assessment for, why do we have to go to panel? It's obvious that this is...
No, I mean, I don't know that you can challenge the process. You can challenge the outcome. And what you're saying is that, I mean, we'll look at some cases on this, but I don't think you could say, I'm not going to allow this to go to panel. I don't think a court or an ombudsman would get involved in that, as long as it's not a delaying device, which sometimes it is.
Well,
With the NHS, it is often a delaying device because we only sit every 3 months. But as long as it's not going to delay it, it's just an unnecessary procedure that the ombudsman would not get involved in, the courts wouldn't get involved in, unfortunately. But once they say cut it, then you can challenge it and say, what's the evidence that you've got that the social worker didn't have? And it can't be resources, because budget's irrelevant. So you can challenge the outcome, and most people that do challenge the outcome succeed. The trouble is that they are normally well-informed, well-connected people, and 80%, 90% don't challenge it. And so these things continue to function.
So we could go to the panel and argue our case actually at the panel, because it's not a secret court, we are allowed to attend.
Yeah, and almost rather it was a secret court, then it makes it even more difficult. I think you've got to be quite, it's quite intimidating to go into a meeting with lots of professionals that you don't know and you're on your own, even if you've got an advocate. And I just think I wouldn't.
But if we all went and started going, it might disappear. Because
Yeah, I mean,
want us all there.
yeah, a lot of local authorities, not a lot of local authorities, but a number of local authorities are getting rid of panels. So just be aware that these things exist, and all local authorities are aware that they are dodgy. The statutory guidance says as much. It says in some cases panels may be appropriate to sign off large or unique allocations. And I agree. If you've got somebody and that you've decided they need £4,000 a week, which is not, unique. I mean, that will happen. The local authorities will be spending £2,000 or £3,000 or more £1,000 a week on some people. Then I think it's quite reasonable that you get a lot of senior officers together to discuss that, because there may be cheaper ways of meeting that need. There may be other things that can be done. So they're saying it may be appropriate for sign-off of large or unique allocations. Where used panels should be appropriately skilled and trained, and local authorities should refrain from creating or using panels that seek to amend planning decisions, i.e. social workers, micromanage the planning process or in place purely for financial reasons. Many local authorities require nearly everything to go to a panel, which means that they're micromanaging the process. The panel, this is a case where the panel rejected an assessor's identification of need, and the Ombudsman said, look, I'm not persuaded this panel was just looking at compliance with the Care Act and cost effectiveness. If it was its remit, it failed to do so. it's possible that her needs could have been met in other ways, but not through a decision in direct contravention of the care manager's recommendation by a panel who was not involved in the assessment. So the Ombudsman is saying the same thing as I've said, as the guidance has said. So what some authorities have done is to say, well, if something goes to the panel, the social worker mustn't make a recommendation, because then we can't be seen as countermanding it, because there isn't a recommendation. So you could get over this problem that we're not contradicting the social worker's recommendation, because there wasn't one. They're just telling us the facts. But there's been another Ombudsman's case against Bromley, where the Ombudsman said, no, there must always be a recommendation from the social worker. And that's what you need to get hold of. With our students who do a lot of this work, they're always saying, oh, this is outrageous, the social worker didn't assess the person as needing this care, when it's quite obvious from the evidence that they needed it. But when you look at it, you say, no, you're wrong. If you look at the assessment, the social worker has identified the need. It's been the panel or the senior officer that's overruled them. It's not the social worker. Normally they're just the messenger. And just repeating what I've said is that local authority financial difficulties, finances are relevant to how to meet needs, but not whether to meet the needs. And you can't have arbitrary limits. Any issues on what I've been saying? Sorry.
Regarding disability living expenditure.
Disability living expenditure?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oxfordshire County Council are imposing from the 1st of October that everybody's will be 25% of PIP or DLA. Are they legally allowed to do this with a blanket charge? Because they do give an opportunity for people to challenge it, but of course many people won't.
Yeah. Okay. So this is where local authorities decided you have needs, they're putting in a service, and then but they can charge for that. You've always been able to charge for care services in this country since 1948. So I'm getting 20 hours support a week. That's costing the local authority £200 a week. They then want to see what my income is so they can charge me. There's a formula. The first thing one has to say is that there is no duty to charge. Local authorities don't have to charge. The law gives them a discretion. They all do. They didn't used to, but they all do now, because a fifth of their... I'm trying, my maths isn't very good. About 20% of all local authority social care expenditure is raised through charging, particularly for residential care. There's a different rule for residential care and care at home, and you're talking about care at home. If you're getting care and you live at home, the local authority can charge you. They can't take into account anybody else's income. So if you're married, they should ignore your spouse's income, although they can take it into account if you agree, and sometimes it might be in your interest to agree to that. They just look at your income, and they must work out basically what your basic income support would be, and they add 25% to that, and that's basically your minimum income guarantee. I'm doing this very crudely, but that's basically a figure below which you cannot be put. But they must also take into account your disability-related expenditure. It's called DRE. So some people, even though they've got this buffer of 25% above income support, which is a very little amount of money, but the charging reduces poor people to penury, but they're allowed to keep a very basic amount, which is income support was 25%. But some of those people might have additional high costs, like they need, because they're frail, they need to have much more heating, they might have much more laundry expenses, they might have significant sort of food costs because of their diet. Those things are called disability-related expenditure. And the local authority's got to add that on top of your buffer. And then you end up with saying, well, you've got to retain your income support, 25% plus £40 for disability-related expenditure. So you've got to be able to keep £150. What we're providing you with is £200 worth of services, so we're going to charge you £50. Now, that's the formula that they should use. They can just say, look, instead of just doing a calculation of all your disability-related expenditure, your laundry, your heating, your food, and things like that, we'll just offer you, we'll just say as a standardised rate, we'll give you a quarter of your, whatever the figure was, half or a quarter of your disability living allowance. And some people might just take that to avoid the bureaucracy of going through. But they cannot insist on that. So if an individual says, no, I want you to go through my disability-related expenditure, they've got to itemise it and do it seriatim, each item. Does that?
So really what you're saying is they can't put a blanket charge in place.
They can't, but they can say, we want a light touch charging policy, and we don't want to subject you to the rigmarole of having to give all this personal information. So we've got this simple formula, trust us, we're a local authority, and this is our simplified light touch system. If you want, we can do the whole rigmarole. They can't suggest that you'll only get that brutal thing. We've just done some, so one of the outputs, but disability-related expenditure is quite a movable feast. So people tend to talk about laundry costs, heating costs, stuff like that. There's been a recent ombudsman said that if you've got to pay attorney for managing or a guardian, a deputy, that fee would be disability-related expenditure. Be taken out. We've just done I just really think it's a lovely piece of research on, I never thought in my life I would be doing research on pets. But I have just done with my students a piece of research on pets. One of the biggest problems for older people and younger people with learning disabilities is loneliness. Loneliness, social isolation reduces your life expectancy by 25%. Loneliness is really bad for you. There's lots and lots of government discussion and policy papers saying, well, the way you solve loneliness is to get a dog. I'm not sure I agree with that, but an awful lot of people, 25% of the population have a dog, 25% of the population have a... I'm an expert on pets, by the way, at the moment. Pets are quite expensive to keep. Anyway, there's a report we've just done with our students on disability-related expenditure saying, well, keeping a dog is probably one of the most effective ways of staving off many of these outcomes, like loneliness and health. We asked the local authorities in this country whether they would allow pet care costs as disability-related expenditure. And guess what? They said no. All of them. So yes, so it's one of these problematical things. You need to know the game. On my website, I have got on the resources thing, challenging local authority care charges. So that looks at other cunning ways of challenging these things. But we've also got this pet care costs and disability-related expenditure, which is a sweet piece of work, actually. If you like dogs. It was done with the benefit of Blue Cross charity. Sorry, lady here and then lady there.
when the Oxfordshire County Council was consulting on this, there were people I was talking to who was carers who said, from their point of view, the amount of disability-related expenditure of the person they were caring for was a lot more than what they thought the county council was going to say. Is it? There were things like they spent more on washing and heating, because you've got to heat for everybody, not just the. Can you challenge?
Yeah, absolutely. It's evidence. It's all about evidence. If you look at my note on my site about this, there's a very nice Ombudsman's report. It's quite old now, against Durham, where a woman with quite significant disabilities was getting a big package. Durham assessed her, and they said, you need to pay £80 a week or something like that. And she said to them, well, look, this is my income, and this is my expenditure. And my expenditure exceeds my income. Now, the law says that the charge must be reasonably practicable for you to pay. And she said, I've given you evidence. This is my income, this is my expenditure. My expenditure exceeds my income. You're saying I've got to actually find £80 from this. I'm saying it's reasonably impracticable for me to pay it. Point to something on this list that I shouldn't be doing. And they said, no, we're just going to do it. And the Ombudsman said, no, the onus is on you to show it's reasonably practical. So you've got to go down this list and say, well, I mean, and I think it was true that she was claiming foods that she was eating every day. And you could say, well, that's ridiculous, you could say, every other day you could eat or something like that. So the way you challenge these charging is to produce a list of your income, a list of your expenditure, and say, tell me something on that list I shouldn't be spending it on. And unless they can point to something, then they haven't got the evidence to show that it's reasonably practicable. So I, in my note, I sort of go through those sort of issues. So clearly the local authority is going to, well, no, I mean, it's only a cynical person like me would say clearly a local authority is going to perhaps underestimate the expense of being a disabled person, because we know being a disabled person is very expensive. And that's why you get disability living allowance, to compensate you for those costs.
If they're taking your 25% and they're leaving you basically on the poverty line, so disabled young adult in a house and they're on the poverty line, it means that they won't be able to afford to go out to cinema and stuff. Can you use the well-being principle to say that actually my little Freddie can go bowling because Henry, who hasn't got a disability, can go bowling every 3 months or something? So why should he be stuck at home doing nothing? So you can use it for his activities.
And you can use care that you provide privately that wasn't assessed as needed. So some people say that I'm paying for my housekeeper, to clean the house, and you could pay for an escort to accompany Fred to his bowling or whatever.
Yeah.
So the list of disability-related expenditure is.
It's not just housekeeping.
It's not an exhaustive.
It is for well-being.
Sure.
Well.
So you can't charge more that would undermine somebody's well-being. So there's lots of arguments. I mean, local authorities, because charging it's very expensive to collect quite small sums of money. So they try. The research suggests that for every with home care, a third of it is wasted on administration. So it does raise money, but it's only 60%. So they try to standardise this. They try to have an algorithm that basically says this is what the charge is. And then you have to say, no, I'm sorry, I don't want the algorithm. I want you to go through and do it, pencil and paper.
As a real person.
And then you've got this evidence game. I produced evidence that I can't afford it. You produce evidence. The onus is now on you to show that I can afford it. I produced evidence to show that this will affect my well-being. I won't get out. And there's some quite useful guidance on younger disabled people. So you can raise it. I mean, I had a client, and she was an older person, but she was actually in a residential care home, but she had she had spent down her capital by mistake, and she was a sort of pillar of the community and she the church and things. So because she hadn't got the money, she couldn't do those sort of activities in the community. So we just eventually got the local authority to raise it. I mean, it was to do with church, so they obviously agreed. In my case, I mean, my alcohol bill is way above. But why shouldn't people be able to drink? You know, I mean.
Okay, I'll add it to the list.
Well, I think it's pretty important. It's self-medication. It's a lot of things. So you know, it's a bit like charging. It seems to me is very much like dealing with the poor law commissioners. You've got these people that say, well, you can afford this, when they haven't got a clue what living on £90 a week is involved.
Especially for supported independent living, so that they can
Yeah, I think charging is disgraceful, and I mean, I have a standard letter that involves using the phrase poor law commissioners, because if you read about how people paraded before the poor law commissioners and had to sort of demonstrate their destituteness, we're almost in that situation again.
Can we use the Disability Discrimination Act as well?
No, this is in the law. The law allows it to be done. And, you know, the law is predicated on the adverse treatment of poor people. That's capitalism, isn't it? Sorry, there was a... Sorry, I'll come back to you.
The local council have a formula that they work to. Are you saying that you don't have to go with that formula?
Well, they have a formula that was probably administratively saves a lot of time, and for some people will be fine. But you can say, I don't want that formula. You see, what the guidance says is you do not have to charge. If you do charge, you mustn't leave people with less than 25% of their minimum income, 25% of their benefit, basic benefits, plus their disability-related expenditure. Local authorities can then say, well, we can do 25% of your benefits. That's the minimum income guarantee. That's a figure that's issued by the government every year. But the disability-related expenditure is going to be quite a lot of time sitting down and working all these things out. How much washing powder, how much the electricity of a wash is. And so we will have a rule of thumb, a sort of heuristic point of view, that it's this figure. Yes. And you could say, I don't want to play that game. I want you to sit down and do the numbers because your figure doesn't accord with my reality.
Yeah.
And then they would have to do it.
But they won't tell you how the formula is worked out.
No, that would be a commercial secret.
And it's absolutely impossible when they allow you more for having your windows cleaned than for actually having somebody to help you with your washing if you're not capable of doing it.
Yeah,
it's crazy.
We did. I mean, I've done some freedom of information requests on this, and of course they stand back saying we can't tell you it's a commercial secret. But often they don't know because they bought an off-the-shelf algorithm, and they don't know what the coding is on that. And then they go back to the proprietor that's done this, and they say, well, we're not going to tell you. It's a commercial secret. So the local authority doesn't even know these systems. And it's really, in a way, pointless. I mean, unless you get pleasure from making them embarrassed. It's better to just say, look, I just want you to get the pen and pencil out, and paper and pencil out and do it. Sorry.
What about mortgage payments?
Yeah, your housing costs are taken out before. Chapter 8 of my big book on community care has got 150 pages, so read that. But basically, when we work out what your available income is, we take out your housing costs and your council tax, but we don't take out. We leave into the equation water rates, electricity, gas. So that's all got to come out of your 25% plus thing. There is a contentious issue. If you have a disabled if you have a disabled child, and they're likely to live with you, when they get to 16, give them a written contract for rent. Because if you've got a written contract saying we expect you to pay us rent and get an advocate to sign it, then you could take into account that that would be one of their disability-related expenditures, because most families don't have to subsidise their 20-year-old son with free accommodation. You'd expect them to pay. But if you don't have a tradition of requiring rent from disabled children, they won't allow that as a housing expenditure. There's some court cases on that. So yes, one of the things is if you do have a disabled child that becomes an adult and is like to live with you, then make sure that you've got a statement saying they must pay rent. Then that is taken out of their income as well, because they won't be able to get housing benefit for it normally. I mean, there's the event. Is that all right? Okay. And the law says you must be given copies of people's assessments and their care plans, and the disabled person can specify who else they want their care plan to be given a copy to, an assessment. So you can get, if the person's got capacity, just get them to say, look, I want you to copy this care plan to my mother, my brother, and my sister. If they lack capacity, then it would have to be given to the main carer. I've already said this, but this is Bromley. The local authorities mustn't assume a carer is willing or able to provide care, including additional care arising from a reduction in care package. It would be maladministration for reduction to occur without assessing the carer and explicitly clarifying and recording whether she is willing and able to provide that care.
That's the assessment of a carer?
No, the disabled person. So you're saying the disabled person we're going to cut their package. If they're living with a carer, the carer would have to say, well, I'm delighted about this because I'm just thrilled to be giving another 20 hours a week. Sorry, this is stuff I'm going to move on. We're going to look at parent carers briefly. That was on the notes. So parent carers are people that care for a disabled child. A child is somebody under 18. What we've already noted is that many parent carers will be caring for the disabled young person, somebody under 18, but they'll probably also be caring for another adult. They may have an adult disabled child, or they might have somebody else, often a parent, that they're caring for. So many people are sandwich carers. But if you're only caring for a disabled young person, then you have rights under the Children Act. The Children Act didn't always give those people rights, but in 2015 it was amended to add these rights. The Children Act was amended by the Children and Families Act 2014, and the Children and Families Act added into the Children Act some additional rights. So parents caring for disabled children now have a right to an assessment under section 17ZD of the Children Act. And that sort of might seem the most stupid thing to do, but sometimes when you write to a local authority and say, look, I believe that you should have assessed me as a parent carer, a snippet of law is lovely, and you could say brackets, and I think this might be section 17ZD, close brackets. It's all you need to say, and it will strike fear into most people that you know that level of detail. You don't need to know anything else about the Children Act, just remember 17ZD. 17ZA is young carers, by the way, their rights. And a parent carer is somebody who provides care for a disabled child. End of story. And you've got to have regard to the well-being of the carer. Well, what's well-being? Well, one of those things is the right to work, leisure, training, education. So we have an ombudsman's case here, a single mother with 2 children, one with significant disabilities and in need of constant supervision. Very common to be a single parent if there's a disabled child, because they cause huge disruptions, including to marriages. The council said that it was her duty to organise her work responsibilities around her children. That it was not its responsibility to provide support to enable her to work. Many councils say that. We don't do babysitting. It's your job, it's your kid, your responsibility. Well, that's just not true, because the Care Act, the Children Act says that parent carers have a right to work, education, training and leisure activities. But local authorities are stuck into this sort of old-fashioned model. It's your kid, don't expect us to look after it. And of course we all have a responsibility to look after our children. But if the child has got additional needs, so that we can't use the same after-school club, we can't use the same holiday club because they are not equipped to deal with a child with those needs, then we have additional needs because of disability. And if you have a policy like that, you're not only discriminating on grounds of disability, but you're also discriminating on grounds of sex, because it's largely going to have an adverse impact on women, because there are more women than men are carers. So you can challenge policies like that on the grounds of the Equality Act. But it's also a breach of the Children Act that says that parent carers have a right to work like everybody else. But they said, look, we're really soft-hearted people, so that the respite breaks you get in the summer, you could use, you get 2 weeks in the summer, well, you've got 14 days, so you could use that for each Monday. You're at work or something like that, which of course would mean she didn't get any break in the summer, but she could then use it to stay and work. And the Ombudsman hadn't much trouble here. The council failed to understand the law. The child's assessment and the care assessment feed into each other. The council knew that the son needed constant supervision. The council knew the mother was in full-time work and she couldn't pursue flexible working. As you probably know, and in the carer's guide that I mentioned earlier, there's a section on employment. Carers have a right, well, everybody now has got a right to flexible working, to ask to change their hours because of caring or other commitments. And the employment.
That doesn't work in the real world, then.
Pardon?
That doesn't work in the real world.
No, we published some research to show that most carers who ask for flexible working don't get it. I want to be slightly uplifting in this last session, if that's all right. So no more references to the real world until sort of for the next half hour, please. Yeah, we're doing some work with the Disability Law Service, great organisation who I'm involved in. We're doing some research on trying to amend that to make there's an obligation to have reasonable adjustments. But at the moment, it's not a very great right. It's worth pursuing. I mean, I will stick up for it. But it's not a great right. Well, it's got its good points. Anyway, she couldn't.
I work closely with our HR team in my work, and we're definitely expecting people to be asking for flexible.
Yeah. I mean, in bigger employers, it's easier, I think. I mean, I work at a university, half my life, and they're brilliant on carers, actually. They're very, very good indeed. And everybody's asked if they are caring, and we get lots of emails about it. So there are some very good organisations. Anyway, the right, I mean, for sometimes you can't pursue, if you've got a job that really you are unique and they can't sort of move you around, then, and she was, so she didn't have any scope, wiggle room to do flexible working. So she was stuck, and the local authority was saying, well, it's not our problem, Ducky, it's yours. And the Ombudsman said that this just was irrational. They have to address her needs, and they've got to look at the son's needs. Government guidance clearly states authorities should not assume a carer is happy to continue in their caring role. Council are required to consider whether a carer wants to work. Nothing in the assessment suggests the council properly considered the impact on her if she did not receive support during the school holidays. So the Ombudsman has been pretty positive on these things. Now, the only other thing I've got to do quickly, and then we'll have a sort of more open session, and this is very brief, is transitions. Because this is where the law's been changed slightly as well, much for the better. In the non-real world, probably, but transitions are really difficult for local authorities to manage, and I've written about this quite a lot. Transition from a disabled child into adult services, from children's services to adult services, from paediatric services to adult services, are killing fields. They tend to go wrong. And that's because although there's wonderful guidance on this, there are management problems. I won't go into that. But one of the problems is also that when you become 18, you cease to be entitled to services under the Children Act, and you suddenly become entitled to services under the Care Act. You cease to get help from the Children's Social Services Department. You now become the responsibility of the Adult Social Services Department. And until the law was amended, adult social services didn't have to assess you until you were 18. But when you became 18, you ceased to be eligible for support from the children's services. So you had this sort of period when you lost your children's support and you didn't have any adult support because they were assessing you. The Act has amended that. And this doesn't just apply to disabled children. When a disabled child becomes 18, they move from the children's team into the adults team. But so does their parent, because when they're under 18, the parent is getting support under the Children Act as a parent carer. But once the child becomes 18, the parent then gets support from the adult team under the Care Act. So it's not only the child that's transiting from one service to another, but it's also the parent, and it's also young carers who become 18. Now, under the old law, if you were a disabled child, at 14 you're supposed to have your special education transitional planning should start. Often it doesn't, but that's spelt out in the SEN regulations. And when you're 18, you then flip from one to the other. So the Children Act would continue till a minute before midnight, and a minute after midnight, you cross the cliff edge to adult social services. And I don't think the problem with transitions is a legal problem, but if it was, that's been solved, because that is no longer the case. Now, you have three more. You have 14, 16, 18, and a CM. When I first prepared this PowerPoint, I mean, all my PowerPoints are prepared whilst drunk. The next morning, I just couldn't remember what CM was. It's convenient moment, brothers and sisters. So what happens now is that you've got a young person who's getting support under the Children Act. And at some stage, adult social services have an obligation to assess them, to tell them what they will get once they become an adult. And I think in general that's going to be when the young person is 16. So when they're about 16, you've got to say to adult social services, we want you to do a Care Act assessment of this 16-year-old. So you can tell us the moment they become an adult what services they will get. And we'll see in a minute that they must do that. When they become 18, so when they're about 16 or 17, you're told what they will get once they become an adult. Once they become an adult, you can carry on funding them under the Children Act, even though they're over the age of the Children Act, until a convenient moment arises for them to switch from one to the other. And the guidance says that it will be very unusual for a young person to switch from children to adults at 18. It will be when there is a review, when it is convenient. It could be 20, 21, 22. So that there's no legal justification anymore for this cliff edge, that children's services should continue. And of course, the experience of many disabled young people is that once they become an adult, they just lose huge amount of support. But of course, what's the evidence? Their need is exactly the same. The law says their needs must be met. So on what possible basis can the local authority say you no longer need that? And the general formula that it says that where it appears to a local authority that it's likely that a person will have care and support needs after transition, and it would be a benefit to them to be assessed, then they must assess. This would be, so it's when it is likely, and you say, well, that's likely when they're 16 in many cases. The government makes it clear that significant benefit is only about timing. Obviously, you're going to have to assess them before they're 18, and it's when it will be best. And if the local authority refuses to assess, they must give written reasons. There's a nice case, and I'll stop this phase now, but given in the statutory guidance. So this is Isabel, and she's 15 years old. She's got complex needs. She goes to a residential school 38 weeks a year, and that's funded by Education and Social Services. And she's cared for at home at the weekends and the holidays. So Social Services are doing 14 weeks a year, and the Education Department is funding the other 38 weeks. When she's 16, the parents ask the local authority to assess her for transition. They want to know what's going to happen when she's 18. The local authorities say, no, it's too soon. Since the support from school continued till she's 19, and transition will be straightforward, as adult social services simply need to begin funding the package. What the parents are saying, however, is that when she's 18, we don't expect her to live with us. We want her to move into supported living. And that's a really key issue for parents, I think. If you don't get your child into supported living, moving out at about 18, you probably never will. So what they're saying, we want her to live in supported living. And I'll come back to that in a minute. Well, to find suitable supported living would take a couple of years at least. And I'll explain, because they might say, well, we want her to live in supported living within half a mile of us in a unit with people with similar impairments, and we want you to go out and build that, which is not unreasonable, I don't think, for them to say. So that's going to take a bit of time. And so this is an incredibly reasonable authority, it's Oxfordshire, and they say that the local authority, therefore, it was a significant benefit to take place at 16. I'll finish on that. That's the last transition thing. On my website, I wrote a post not long ago about transition and why it's such a difficult thing. And I was dealing with a parent who was having really a meltdown because the local authority was being very unreasonable. Robert Graves used to live around here. None of you are young and old enough to remember Robert Graves. Robert Graves was a very famous writer, poet. Wrote I Claudius and some, I think, great poems. He was he fought in the First World War. He wrote Goodbye to All That, and was a bit of a curious person. Anyway, he tells a story in Goodbye to All That, which is, he wrote in 1928 of his reminiscences of the First World War. I think he died in 1990 or something. But he wrote his autobiography in about 1928. He tells a story that he was living in he was on a low income. He was married. He was working at the university in Oxford, but he was on a very low income with his wife, and they had 2 kids. And he spent all his time trying to find somewhere to live, because they didn't want to live in the city. They couldn't afford to live in the city. So they lived out in the countryside around, but he had to get in. And whenever they went anywhere, they could never get it. It was always gone, or it was too expensive. It wasn't this, it wasn't that. So what his wife decided that they should do is they should just sit down and say what would be perfect. And so he said that they decided they wanted to live in a village with a church with a spire, not a tower. It had to have 2 pubs, it had to have a shop, and it had to be within 2 miles of Oxford or something like that. And it had about 3 other very specific things. And having defined exactly what they wanted, 2 weeks later something became available, which is exactly that, and they got it. And it seems to me that that's what you need to do with transition planning, but also with many other situations in social care. You've got to project manage this. Don't expect social services to. They just don't have the resources. They can't do medium-term planning. They're doing crisis. And you've got to tell them that I want Fred to live in supported living half a mile from me. And this is where the sort of people that he's going to be sharing with. And yes, you can certainly go out and build a property, or you can get a housing association to do it, or you can rent from the private sector. And this is what he's going to have. And so in many of these sort of areas, you've got to tell them what they're going to do, rather than sort of run around for the least awful situation. And if you turn it over that way, in my non-real world, that is actually a very much more effective way of getting care plans that you need, is to just sit down and say, this is what we need. Because the law says your needs must be met. And if you define it with some precision, then the local authority is going to have difficulty not meeting that need. So that was the session, you might not have noticed it, on transitions and problem solving. I think we've got a sort of open session now on sort of general questions from NHS continuing care and carers and mental health. Far away, so there's... Is that all right? Is that how we're going to do it, Jan?
Yes.
Great.
That's up to you.
Yeah.
So could I just add a couple of things to transition, which I'm sure you know about, but you haven't mentioned. In health, just before your child reaches 18, they cease to be under the care of paediatric services and they go to adult. And I found that the only way to make that transition was that I went looking for the consultants who would take over, but there aren't many parents who could have done that. And then I also know of the education side. Not every young person with a disability leaves education completely at 19, and they may have special support needs relating to their education when they go on to some kind of they may be able to go into university, for instance, and again it gets very, very complicated, and unless you're very rich and going to employ a case manager, it's very difficult to be able to do all of those transitions at once.
Yeah, I mean, what we say, I mean, with Cerebra, we've written a guide on transitions is, and it's in the Disabled Children's book, is that you've got to project manage this. Don't expect, unfortunately, the local authorities or the health service or the education to do it. It's a bit like if you're doing up a house, you've got to have a plan which you can have help with, but you've got to deal with the electrician, the plumber and the builder, because they're going to have a squabble and blame everybody else. And you've just got to be the project manager. And don't expect social workers to project manage that, because they just are so overwhelmed that the idea of medium-term planning, they can do short-term crisis. So if you want to get services, it's simple, create a crisis. Create a big crisis, you'll get it. Local authorities are very good at that. They're also very good at long-term planning, beautiful blue sky, glossy brochures, 5-year plan. Senior managers just love that. Lots of sort of sandwich lunches and dealing with sort of graphic designers. Medium-term stuff, they just have a real problem with. And there's no getting away from it. It's been a problem for 20, 25 years. So you've got to realise that it isn't going to happen, and you're going to have to do it yourself, or get get support from somebody to help you, and roll your sleeves up and say, look, I'm sorry, this is going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, amplifying on that comment that you just made, and more generally, I mean, one of the big issues for carers is not only paying and rights, it is simply that the resources are not available.
Yeah.
And many of us who have been carers have known what it is that we want for good care in an ideal world, but you simply can't find it because it isn't there. It harks back to your comment about provision of social care and decline in numbers of care homes and the like.
Yeah.
And I realise you're not going to have an answer to that, but it is a major difficulty.
Yeah, I think and I think that again is why sort of carer's voice and carer's posture is so important, in the sense that it's that strategic work where you're saying, look, you're not providing this service, and there's a real need. And one of the in the problem-solving guide, which is the too difficult to think about, they're so far-fighting. You've got to say a reasonable public body, having been told that there is this supply-side problem, would at least prepare a plan within 6 weeks to explain how within 6 months this supply side, because they're supposed to manage the market. And you don't have time to solve the world for everybody else, but strategically I think that's why organisations like this are really important, to say, look, there is a supply side problem, you've got to address it. We've done some work on, I'm doing some work on direct payment rates. Direct payment rates are so low that you just can't employ people that have got, if you've got somebody with attention deficit hyperactive disorder or sort of challenging autism, you can't employ somebody at £9 an hour or £8 an hour who's got those applied behavioural skills. You need 20, but they won't do that. So they'll save £11 an hour, but within 2 years that child will be a looked after child at £5,000 a week. And so what we do is the strategic research that shows that actually not funding these things is incredibly expensive. And so you need universities and organisations, but in the short term you're left with just nothing at the moment. Yeah, sorry, that's bleak.
And then you're into disaster management.
Yeah, you're into crisis, and local authorities do this because they think it's saving money, but what they don't tell you is it's very expensive, because although they save on all those little budgets, they have this enormous budget called crisis. Yeah. Because once you fall into crisis, they'll pay £4,000 a week. That crisis budget is hemorrhaging money.
Yes, but that's an NHS cost.
Well, it's not always, actually. It's a crazy world. Sorry.
I just wanted to ask if there are any elements of the human rights legislation that help here as well, in terms of right to a family life and things like that.
Right.
It's too big a topic.
Well, it's not really. I'm changing my mind on this. I used to do a lot of human rights cases in Strasbourg for Gypsy and Roma, largely in Central Eastern Europe, but I also took the first one that ever went there, which was a Cambridge case, and lost it. And so I was in human rights. So when the Human Rights Act came into force, when the Act was enacted in '98, I was part of the Judicial Studies training scheme. And so I used to train judges 20 years ago. And they're a sort of curious bunch of people. And the older ones are particularly badly behaved, basically. And they would always sit at the back and giggle, because they've got huge pensions and they're about to retire and they don't want to learn a new silly piece of law that's come from France, as far as they're concerned. And we were at sort of one of these sessions and they were sort of giggling and sniggling. So you said, look, come on, show me this. And they had a bit of paper there. So you said, right, let's have a look at this. And it was a cartoon. and it had 3 images. And the first image said, if your case is strong, and this is what I teach barristers today, really, if you've got a really strong case, when you go to court, you quote the facts. This person has nowhere to bathe their children, they can't do anything, they have to take them out into the garden, hose them down, you know. Those facts, doesn't matter what the law is, you're going to win. If your case is not strong, quote the law. So I used to, in the magistrates, you go to court and you'd say, look, my client, instead of saying he's a completely impeccable careers, you know, never been in trouble, you couldn't say that because the facts weren't very strong. You'd go into the court and you'd say, look, worships, there's a presumption of bail. The Bail Act says there's a presumption of bail. So that the magistrates will immediately know that you don't want to talk about your client and the fact that he's absconded 24 times and committed lots of offences on bail. So you quote the law. So if your case is weak, you quote the law. And the final bit of this cartoon said, and if it's completely hopeless, quote human rights. And in a way, there's a truth in that. In a way, there is a truth in that. There are very few things you want to go into court and just rely on human rights. Even today with the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which is a really powerful document, there hasn't, and that came in 2008 in the UK, there hasn't been one case that has turned on that in the last 10 years. And the British judges tend to say, well, this is against the law, this is against the Equality Act, so I don't need to look at Article 8 of the European Convention or Article 14. So they tend never to want to make a decision simply on human rights grounds. I mean, occasionally it does. The recent marriage case was held to be incompatible with human rights, but it was held to be legal here. So there are cases where I think human rights comes in. But we as lawyers tend to use them very sparingly, and they what's called make weight. We're going to say, look, I think that we can win this on the facts and the law, but if you want, I can talk to you about Article 8. But I mean, I don't think we ever will withdraw from the European Union. I don't think it'll ever happen. But if we did, we will never. It's quite clear that none of the parties want us to withdraw from the European Convention. So the Human Rights Act will remain. The European Convention will remain something we can quote, but we don't often quote it.
Can I start? Hello. You mentioned that in passing that if your child didn't move out at 18 into supported living, they probably never would. I've got a 14-year-old. Should I be really, really excited at the prospect of shoving him out of the door in 4 years, or
no? I mean,
are there reasons, or should I be? What should I do? Should I be making delighted plans, or
you should be doing a Robert Graves, working out now, and you really need to do it now. 14 is, as late as you should do it. Things change, but this is ideally what I want to happen. I'm well into very large numbers of grandchildren now, and I know that children and grandchildren don't leave when you would like them to leave. And I love them all. I love them all, but you've got to really plan. I think often after a young person will go away to college, and it's at that moment nothing's been done, and there is really nothing available. And you would say, well, you should have been sorting this transition plan out, but it's and you will get. Very many parents are given impossible positions that either the child comes back or they go to something that's arisen. They found a placement yesterday. It's got to be a decision by tomorrow lunchtime. You don't have to visit. You've got to make a snap decision. And so I think that, and I'm not in this position. I don't have any disabled children, but I think that I would, look at social services and I wouldn't blink and say, look, I want Fred to be living in supported living when he's 18, 20, 22, with a support package close to us. I want to be involved in his care. But I want to go back to work. I can't do this. I want to do this. And you're going to do that. I'm not saying you've got to kick them out, but there are moments, particularly when they come back from college, that you are on the horns of a dilemma. If you say, most people then say, well, of course he's got to come back because the alternative is too awful, and then of course it just drifts. Nothing happens. So you've got to sort of almost, you've got to be saying very early on, this is going to happen.
Do you think that looking at it from the other side, from the sort of social care side, do you think there are sort of critical points whereby it's kind of easier to persuade people that an 18-year-old should be looking at independent supported living than a 28-year-old who's been living at home comfortably for 10 years, say? Because I just asked that because when my son moved from primary school to secondary school, we wanted him to change schools. It was so easy because the transition point came up, even though the school he was at went on to secondary. Everybody took it for granted that we would have additional choices. I'm not sure we actually did at all. We were still in the special school system, but it was just so much easier just to say, oh yeah, for secondary he'll be going here. Whereas if we'd wanted him to change in year 5, I think we would have had a bit of a legal case on our hands because everybody would have said no. So I just wondered if there was a sort of... Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think you've got to, those nodes, those key points, and it's probably when they're finishing school or when they're finishing college. And I think it's, for me, I've got a very skewed view of all this, but it seems to me at the end of college, that is often a really important moment, and it's interesting that the guidance uses that example as well. They're going to move on, and of course there's less resistance now because supported living and shared lives isn't that expensive for local authorities, but they'll then say, well, you'll go into this. We've got this place, and it's just for people with, and they'll have sort of pigeonholes they'll push you in, and you've got to say no, that's not suitable. I want something tailor-made, and it's not necessarily going to be that expensive because you can get it from the private sector. And I want it within, and location's important. It's got to be close to us. So, but I think yours is a very good point. There will be points at which the resistance is much less than at others. Yeah.
A very low percentage of care home residents are currently eligible for NHS continuing health care. Yeah. Why do you think, it's quoted something like 15%, but the actual number of people who should be eligible is much higher. Why do you think the figure's so low?
Oh, sorry.
I'm just going to answer that. Sorry.
Should I deal with this now? Sorry about that. Sorry. I've got 8 laws of social work. I won't tell you the first one, but there are 8 laws of social work. One day I'll write a paper on this. And the 8th law is the NHS is better at negotiating than social services. The NHS is much better at saying no. And that's why they've been shunting people across that boundary for the last 30 years. So the NHS just says no. You're not eligible. Although the courts have a whole series of cases, as you're well aware, laid down very, very clear statements that the bar to continuing care is quite a low one. In practice, you've got to be virtually dead. 1/3 of all people who get continuing health care are fast-tracked. They're likely to die in the very near future. 1/3 now are within weeks of death. So yes, a lot of people are. And I should explain that we have people from Beacon here, who is a not-for-profit expert organisation on continuing healthcare. So if you were interested in that, there they are. And whenever I get an email from anybody, I say contact Beacon, because it's very short. But of course, continuing healthcare is it can be very useful, but it doesn't necessarily be very useful. It's very useful if you are wealthy and you are a child that's expecting to inherit all of that. I'm not sure I'd want disabled children always, young people, to be continuing healthcare, because they are then care managed by the NHS, and I think social services tend to care manage slightly better. So continuing healthcare is very advantageous if you are somebody who's acquired wealth. It's very advantageous to your children.
I must be thick because I don't know what continuing.
Continuing healthcare is, there's a point, there's 2 acts that deal with people that have health and social care needs. Health, which is the NHS Act 2006, and the Care Act. Today we've been just talking about the Care Act. Section 22 of the Care Act says that there's a point above which you can't get social care. And that's when you've got your healthcare needs are of such a level that you become the responsibility of the NHS. And once you're the responsibility of the NHS, they have to fund all your health and all your social care. So if you're in a care home costing £1,000 a week and you've got very significant needs, if you get held to be eligible for continuing healthcare, the NHS would have to pay all those fees because you can't pay for NHS. NHS is free at the point of need. So for people in care homes in particular, being held to be eligible for continuing healthcare means that they cease to have to pay for that. And the point is made is that very many people in nursing homes particularly, but also residential care homes, ought to get continuing healthcare, but they don't. And that's because the NHS is not very keen on funding that. Because it's short of money, like everybody else. Sorry.
Well, I was just going to say our personal experience. My father died just after Christmas, and I was arguing for fast track right to the end, and also had to go through the process of end of life care and all of it. So.
Did it have a happy ending? Obviously you don't. But,
happy ending with regards, yes, we won. But,
did you?
November time, I got dying man next door,
yeah.
And it was up for review. So
yeah, I write a lot about continuing healthcare, and on my website, I've got a section called lectures, and I have YouTubes of various areas, and I've got a YouTube about continuing healthcare. But it happens at the very worst position. Yeah, sorry.
Probably all of us here sort of kind of have voices and can do the things we're talking about, that you're talking about very interesting. But is there a kind of red flag system or something for people who, for one reason or another, are not able to fight? For example, much older carer who's not aware of these things, or what about people who can't fight or don't know how to fight or are not in a position to fight? Is there any sort of system which identifies them as these people won't be able to put up a fight?
No. We're nearly at the end, and that is such a grim statement. No. And what we're hearing increasingly is local authorities and the NHS, because their budgets are squeezed, not telling people what their rights are, and saying, I'm sorry, the panel said no, and there's nothing I can do about that, and I can't possibly tell you this because I wouldn't put that in because the panel won't allow it. And so there's this, unless you have that network, it's grim. There's some magic happy solution you're going to come up with.
No. There was just 2 points I wanted to make, actually.
Yeah, we've got to make the last one here.
Sorry, the last one. The first was that when we were talking about planning ahead for younger children, I'm a family carer myself, but I also work with a small organisation, Oxford Family Support Network, and we support family members who have a family member with a learning disability. And we did something called Hope. It's kind of like Hopes and Fears and What Do We See for Our Future. And that's a really good document to do, to hand over to your social
manager, care worker, to kind of give them that indication down the line of what you are expecting, so they've kind of got it written in evidence. And then the other thing was just to say, for anybody who isn't able to speak up for themselves, that's exactly what we do, is we support families who don't have the voice or don't know what to, they want some support to fight the system, and so we're always contactable.
Great. Say the organisation again.
Oxfordshire Family Support Network.
Thank you.